can Andy Burnham find the grit, the toughness, the ruthlessness to make those kind of tough decisions? We don't know.
From what you've seen of Burnham, what does his style tell you about how he's likely to behave in a crisis?
At the moment, the British are not pulling their weight.
Britain is now in its 7th Prime Minister in 10 years, and this one has arrived at Downing Street with almost no track record on foreign policy, at precisely the moment that the transatlantic alliance is under the most strain in definitely a generation. So does Andy Burnham's ascent mean a shift in how Downing Street handles Washington, how they handle Moscow, Brussels, or even Beijing? Or is it just going to be a changing face and the same script? To help us read the signals, we're joined by someone who has advised prime ministers on exactly these questions. I'm Dominic Bowen, host of the International List podcast, where we unpack the topics that really matter. And today we're joined by Lord Ricketts. He was the UK's first national security advisor, former permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office, and former British ambassador to France. Few people have watched more changes of UK leadership up close or thought harder about what this means for Britain's place in the world. And he's also just published a new book called Peacemakers, Shaping the Modern World, the Men and Women of the Foreign Office in World War II, which is about diplomats who shaped the post-war order. And I think there's a lot of things that we're going to unpack today that'll be incredibly interesting for all of our listeners. Lord Ricketts, welcome to the International List podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Dominic. Very much looking forward to chatting on this rather interesting day.
Very interesting day. So it must be a very exciting day for the new Prime Minister and his family. What do you think's going through his mind today? There must be so much. I mean, the Prime Minister of Britain, what an amazing job.
Yes, I mean, in a way, this is going to be his best day because you arrive, there's all the accolade in 10 Downing Street and the cheering, and you walk in, and then the hard choices start. And so I think he will probably find a deluge of things that need to be done in the first hour, in the first day, in the first 2 or 3 days. He will have his own agenda, of course. I think he's going to make a big domestic policy speech tomorrow. But he will find that international issues are there as well, right from the very start. And I think all prime ministers find that the sheer pace and range of things that come at them once they're inside that famous black door, is surprising. And I expect Andy Burnham is going through that as we record this in his first couple of hours as Prime Minister.
Now, your book, Peacemakers, it's about a generation of Foreign Office figures who had to steady the ship through a massive change of era. And I think many people will look back at the Trump 2.0 and say that it was a similarly tumultuous era. Now, Andy Burnham arrives with almost no foreign policy record. So for someone who's assessing UK risk right now, do you think they should be worried about foreign policy, or is it the civil service and the UK's long alliances that really matter much more than a prime minister?
Well, I think Andy Burnham will inherit Keir Starmer's legacy of British foreign policy, which I think is a good one. Keir Starmer really established himself both in the diplomacy around Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, also in handling British interests through that very difficult period over the war in Iran, when he kept Britain out of the aggressive war, but has helped the Americans since then. European security leadership. He's been very active, and Burnham inherits that on day one. I think the issue for him is not, does he change the fundamental approach? I don't think he will. I think he will be staunch on Ukraine. I think he'll want to push forward on relations with the EU. I think it's how much he is himself going to invest in terms of time. Because Keir Starmer was criticised, I think unfairly, by many colleagues in Parliament for not being there. Never hear Keir was the tag, because international events were pressing in hard. Now, the international events will still press on Andy Burnham, but I think he will probably at the beginning try to show that he's a prime minister paying more attention to the domestic agenda and try and outsource what he can to his new foreign secretary. In my view, that isn't going to work beyond a certain point, because big crisis issues now happen at leader level.
And I think that's a really important point. Now, you were a key architect behind the National Security Council and, of course, the first National Security Advisor under Prime Minister Cameron. So from what you've seen of Burnham as a politician, what does his style tell you about how he's likely to behave in a crisis? Is he going to be someone who's going to seek consensus, or is he going to be someone that's more comfortable making unpopular decisions? What predictions can you make about his style during crises?
And I think we're all going to get to know what his style is, and at the moment it's pretty unknown. I mean, he is an experienced politician. He has got very little track record in international affairs or international crisis management. I think his instinct is consensual, is to be liked, is to try and have everyone on board, using his charm, his personality, his people skills. All that is fine. But as you suggest, being prime minister, especially in a crisis, sometimes involves some very difficult decisions on very little evidence. In the end, you have to make a judgment call. A big call like Keir Starmer made: do I join Donald Trump in the attack on Iran or not? Big stakes on either side, and he called it clearly that he would not. I think that was right. Can Andy Burnham find the grit, the toughness, the ruthlessness to make those kind of tough decisions where perhaps advisors are divided, perhaps public opinion is pushing him one way, instincts in the other? We don't know. We will find that out. But he's an intelligent, experienced politician, so I hope he will understand the need for that.
And how much does it actually matter? I'm wondering about the UK leadership change, and whether you think for business leaders and for politicians in Brussels and DC, how much they actually pay attention to this. Obviously, there's been a rapid succession of leaders in the UK, more than what we've historically seen. But is it matter? And do you think this is being read overseas as just a routine democratic turnover, or is this something that's more consequential globally?
Well, I think it's a surprise to people. I think people used to look at British politics as fairly stable, that a prime minister would be elected for 5 years and get a majority in the House of Commons, possibly then a second one. But to have four prime ministers in 5 years is absolutely not normal in British politics. So if you're someone like Emmanuel Macron, President of France, coming to the end of a 10-year mandate, he would have seen 7 British prime ministers in that time. And that is bound to lead to questions, and also a slight feeling of weariness, I think, that here we go again, once again having to establish a personal relationship. And I think you shouldn't underestimate the importance of personal relationships in international affairs. Yes, of course, we have interests, we have foreign policy bureaucracies, we have certain things which are pretty stable. But equally, the way leaders get on with each other, do they trust each other? Have they looked each other in the eye? Can they be confident that a commitment made person to person will be kept? I mean, those things matter. And so I think Andy Burnham will have to start more or less from scratch in building a relationship with Donald Trump, with Emmanuel Macron, with Chancellor Merz of Germany, and all the others, Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels. That takes time.
Mhm.
And if he doesn't do it, then when the crisis comes, he doesn't have the personal relationship. So I do think that they matter and they do take time. I'm sure he will get to understand that, but he will have the inevitable pushback from his domestic advisors. No, you can skip that international meeting, send the foreign secretary instead. Each time he does that, international leaders will just think, well, is this guy really serious?
Mm.
Is he really a player on the big international issues that count for all of us? That's the dilemma he will face.
And so, talking about relationships, which are obviously incredibly important, and of course, there's French elections in the not too distant future, and a very likely potential leader of France is Marine Le Pen. How do you think that relationship? I mean, that's a very that would be a very interesting relationship to say the least. What would that look like, and what could that do to influence, UK EU defence cooperation and other cooperation that really has to occur between those two powerful countries?
Well, you say interesting in a very diplomatic way, Dominic. I mean, she is an unknown quantity in terms of how she would operate as a leader, but all the signs are she would take a pretty populist, hard right position on international affairs, on France's relationship with the EU. She's been no fan of French support to Ukraine. In the past, she's had an awkwardly close relationship with Russia, although she's walking back from that now. I mean, she's pretty much at the polar opposite on the political spectrum from Andy Burnham. I don't think that they would be natural bedfellows at all. And so, yeah, he would have to work out how he's going to deal with a France that is moved sharply right after having been a leader in the mainstream on in the EU on Ukraine, for example, supporting firmly a kind of European independence as America disengages from NATO and Europe. Where she would be on all of that, I don't know. I think she would put a lot of time into a much more aggressive, difficult relationship between France and the EU, which doesn't do anything to help as we think about taking over greater European control of our security and defence. I don't suppose that the relationship with Britain would be high on her agenda, but for example, on issues like immigration and dealing with small boat crossings of the Channel, I could well imagine that Marine Le Pen would be far less interested in spending French money on preventing people from leaving France to come to the UK. And therefore, I should think that will become a very, very difficult dossier, and the government have to work hard to keep the French cooperating with us on controlling the small boat issue. And Andy Burnham certainly wouldn't want to lose control of that. So that's an example of, less than a year into his prime ministership, he could find, a much more difficult relationship across the Channel.
And you mentioned Ukraine just then, and Andy Burnham will, of course, inherit one of the most significant challenges Europe has faced since the Cold War. If you were briefing the new Prime Minister on Ukraine on his first day in office, what would you be telling him? What are the most important, the most strategic messages that he needs to understand about Ukraine and Europe's security today?
Continuity, I would say, because I think Keir Starmer has done a very good job of putting Britain in a leadership position with the French on supporting Ukraine. And he will need to understand quickly why that is so important. I mean, all the warnings that we've had from Lord George Robertson, for example, the Strategic Defence Review last year, saying Britain has to be ready for warfighting, that we need to learn from Ukraine about how war is changing, how they've managed to hold the Russian advance and begin to roll it back, the role of drones and AI transforming war, all of that he'll need to understand quickly. I think he will need to ring Zelensky early on to declare that Britain is going to stand squarely with Ukraine. But that quickly is going to bring him up against the issue of money, because if we're going to go on supporting Ukraine, if we're going to rebuild Britain's armed forces, Keir Starmer was already deeply involved in difficult discussions with the Treasury and others to find the money to keep ramping up UK defence spending, which is no longer in as good shape as it was among NATO nations. That will pull against Burnham's domestic agenda of spending more to control the cost of living and implement his new policies on taking back public control of water, for example. But if he doesn't continue Starmer's upward trend of defence spending, then Britain's leadership in supporting Ukraine will look increasingly hollow. So there's a whole clutch of very difficult issues there. But I think instinctively he will want to show staunch support for Ukraine and make that clear early on. Certainly hope so.
And you've had an impressive career when it comes to national security and foreign policy. And when we look at Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, it's certainly moving into a very long war and a war of attrition. And sustaining political support may actually become harder than sustaining the military support. And I've been very, very impressed. And at the start, I must say, even surprised about how united Europe has largely been in their support for Ukraine. It's clearly the right decision. But as we look across Europe, and certainly if we extend that to if we look across America today, are you confident about the long term and the coherent strategy for supporting Ukraine? Because there's a difference between managing a conflict and actually trying to shape the outcome. And increasingly, when you look at support for Ukraine, I can't help but feel that we're just managing the conflict as opposed to trying to shape the outcome. How do you feel about how we're managing and how we're supporting Ukraine today?
Well, first of all, but I think we are not doing enough to put Ukraine in position to win, whatever win means. But it is quite remarkable that after longer war than the First World War, over 4 years now, Ukraine is not only in the fight still, but is also pushing the Russians back, kilometer by kilometer. And the UK and other Western countries have done an awful lot to support Ukraine on that, but not just for the sake of Ukraine, but for our own benefit as well. Because if the Russians had succeeded in getting to Kiev or dislodging the Zelensky government, putting in a puppet government, I mean, that would have been terrible for European security. Even now, with the Russians on the back foot, we get constant messages about, they're sabotaging, they're looking at subversive activities, They might try a provocation in the Baltic states, grab a piece of territory and then see how NATO reacts. So however it ends in Ukraine, we're going to be facing a hostile Russia across the center of Europe for the foreseeable future. And therefore, it is in our interest to go on supporting Ukraine. Like you, I've been amazingly impressed that the British public has been so clear and stalwart in supporting Ukraine across the political spectrum. Started with Boris Johnson. It was one of the few parts of Boris Johnson's foreign policy I would have supported, and it's true to this day. As the costs ramp up, of course, it will clash with other spending priorities. And around Europe, we are beginning to see some signs now of fatigue in continuing to bankroll Ukraine. Hungary, the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban was voted out. He was notoriously pro-Russian. We've now got a more mainstream Hungarian government. But if then we get Marine Le Pen coming in France or populists winning in other countries, we could find again support for Ukraine sagging across Europe. And if that happens, and if the Ukrainians then begin to lose the initiative again, it will encourage and embolden Putin, not just in Ukraine, but more widely. So we need to go on being at the forefront, in my view, of supporting Ukraine, explaining to public opinion why, preparing for further provocations from the Russians. I'm not sure we're as resilient as a country as we should be yet. You look across at the Baltic states or a country like Sweden or Denmark, they are doing more. I'll tell you one anecdote I have from being in Denmark quite recently. I talked to their national security advisor, and he said, we're having a debate inside the government. Do we risk telling public opinion that things are so bad that we're going to refurbish the Second World War air raid shelters that still exist in Copenhagen? Eventually, they nerved themselves up and they did it. They announced it. And the reaction of public opinion was, what took you so long?
Mm.
And the public understood better probably than the politicians. They were absolutely up for this. People are more sensible than perhaps sometimes politicians think. So I think that the Burnham government can be more upfront with the people once they've got their feet under the desk to say there are real risks here. Maybe going too far to say we'll be at war with Russia, but in a way, the Russians think they're at war with us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a reality that we have to take into account. So definitely more to be done on preparing British opinion for what could be a difficult period.
Yeah, definitely. And we've had some really interesting guests. And of course, on the International Risk podcast, we try to hear from as many people with diverse views and around the world as possible. And we've had some really interesting guests from Russia and also from China that have spoken about the Cold War. And I remember one guest we had on a couple of years ago, and he said, in the West, you talk about winning the Cold War, and then it ended. But for us, it didn't end. We lost part of it, but for us, we're still fighting it. And I thought that was just such an interesting and such an obvious way to be looking at it, that the war didn't end for some people. It's a Cold War that's been continuing. And when people ask me about the prediction of Russia invading Ukraine, well, you only had to go back to 2007, and there was clear from the Munich Security Conference, and then just example after example where Russia has made it very clear that it was pushing for it wasn't sort of a static, it wasn't a friendly nation. But I'd like to go in the other direction and talk a little bit about how you think the new prime minister is going to need to be developing relationships with NATO in response to the growing threat, but then also with the USA. But before I do that, Peter, I'll just remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please look for us on YouTube and hit the subscribe button. It's really, really important for other people to be able to find our content. So, Peter, some people in the Labor Party expect Burnham to be less differential to President Trump than perhaps Keir Starmer was. What would that look like, and how do you think he should be? I mean, you've seen, we've heard about Macron, we've heard about the head of NATO being, Trump whisperers, people that are able to actually communicate with him and succeed. What would be your advice? You've worked with diplomats, you've written about diplomats, you understand how diplomacy works and how it's successful and when it's not. What would be your advice to him about how should he be engaging with President Trump?
I mean, he's unlike any phenomenon I ever met as a diplomat. And so I think people have been learning over the last few years. And I think Trump, too, after his re-election, is a more difficult customer than Trump 1. Yes, I agree that Keir Starmer started off with quite a deferential tone. But I think over time he's hardened up in his approach to Trump. By the time Trump was threatening to occupy Greenland, for example, Keir Starmer, like Macron and others, was prepared to be pretty blunt with Trump, say he was getting it wrong. And he also stood up to him over Iran, refused the cajoling to join the Americans in their initial strikes or use UK bases to do that. And again, the relationship has survived that. I think the lesson shows that you don't have to be deferential. You need to be absolutely clear what you're trying to achieve. You need to avoid antagonizing him or saying things which he can take as insulting, because then you get punched on the nose back again even harder. But if you're frank and you explain why you're taking a position you are, you don't humiliate him in public, then it's possible to navigate it. I mean, Andy Burnham starts from a position of being pretty unknown, apart from being as a sort of left-wing socialist running a town or whatever it was that Trump said. In the last few days, I think Trump has slightly misunderstood what Andy Burnham said about opening up the North Sea oil fields to further exploration. Trump has long been pushing British governments to do that. Not that it's any of his business at all. So I think there may be a little bit of a, disappointment that what he'd understood Burnham to be saying wasn't quite that. In other words, this is going to be another up and down. No doubt they'll have an initial reasonably polite conversation, but that doesn't mean to say Trump won't come after him at some point and start insulting him, as he does, for example, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. Terrible insults coming from Trump. So he'll have to be ready for that, and he'll have to get used to the fact that although he likes people to like him, Andy Burnham, can't have that internationally all the time. He will have to take a tough line in support of British interests. Unfortunately, there are no more state visit cards to pull out of the pack because Trump has now had 2 state visits to this country. So I think probably he doesn't need to run after Trump, but if he goes to the UN General Assembly week in New York in September, and by the way, I think that will be one of the litmus tests of how seriously he's prepared to take foreign affairs. As you know, almost all the heads of state and government around the world gather for a kind of diplomatic speed dating 2 or 3 days in New York in late September. He could obviously then meet Trump there, as well as a lot of other world leaders. Problem, it comes just before his first Labour Party conference as leader, which will be a big domestic moment for him. And I can well imagine his political advisors saying, oh, no, you don't want to go to New York. You've got to concentrate on your party conference speech. If he's not there, then he will miss out on an opportunity to get alongside Trump and many others. And it would be a first signal, I think, that he's downgrading his own personal engagement in foreign affairs, and other leaders will understand that message.
I think that's a very astute analysis, and I think that's correct. And I think how he prioritizes in the coming weeks about spending as well. And you've talked about the foreign policy agenda versus the domestic one, and NATO is clearly an obvious one where defense spending promises have been made, and whether they're kept will be a more than just a litmus test. It'll be a very clear statement. And you've served across NATO across very different areas. There's obviously going to be a lot of official briefings that Burnham's going to have to receive and digest and analyze and then make decisions based on. What's one thing from your experience that you'd want him to understand that's probably not going to sit in the official brief when it comes to NATO?
I mean, the first and most sobering thing a new prime minister has to do is to sit down quietly in his office on his own and write out 4 letters to each of the 4 captains of our nuclear weapon submarines. And these letters have to tell the captain what he is to do with his nuclear weapon load, which is capable of destroying many cities around the world. What does he do if there's some cataclysm while he is submerged on patrol? London's wiped out, there's no more government, there's been some kind of nuclear attack. What does he do with his nuclear weapons? And he needs instructions from the Prime Minister, even if the Prime Minister is no longer there, as to what. And those letters, each Prime Minister has to write them out. They're sealed up, they're put in a safe on the submarine. And then when the Prime Minister changes, the previous one's taken out, not opened, and put down the shredder. So nobody ever knows exactly what the Prime Minister has told the captain to do. But that's quite a sobering moment when you realize that you are personally responsible for decisions on the nuclear deterrent. So there are issues like that that will be very sobering. On NATO, he needs to understand that to have influence, you have to be seen to be pulling your weight. And at the moment, the British are not pulling their weight. They can't meet all the commitments we've taken in terms of the forces we'll make available to NATO. The armed forces don't have the readiness, don't have the size, numbers of troops. Much of the equipment needs a lot of maintenance, it needs updating. And so keeping our level in NATO, which has always been a leading one, requires defence spending to continue upwards. And if you don't have that, then we will gradually sink down the rankings. People will pay less attention to us. And given that there is the risk of NATO actually having to be put into action in real terms, if the Russians do try some kind of an adventure, say in the Baltic states, we can't afford that. Britain has got to be able to show it continues to lead. I'm sure intellectually Andy Burnham will want that, but he's got to make then the tough spending choices to make sure that's true.
Now, your book, I've read many reviews of Peacemakers. One review I read by another acclaimed author said it's a gripping account of British diplomacy during World War II, filled with high drama, moments of tension. Lord Ricketts vividly brings to the fore some of the most fascinating figures in the history of the Foreign Office, which I thought was a lovely review. Now, I'd be really keen to hear from you when researching the book and bringing it all together. What surprised you most? What were some of the secrets? What were some of the intriguing stories that you heard about the men and women who were working in foreign policy during World War II?
You are so kind to give me a shout out, Dominic. Yes, it's recently come out. I was a diplomat for 40 years, and so I felt I really knew the organization inside out, loved it. And indeed, when I joined, some of the people who were then senior had joined just after the war, so I felt a kind of continuity. And I'd always felt that the Foreign Office sometimes gets airbrushed out of discussions about the Second World War. It's all about Churchill and the generals and the battles. But actually, the diplomats were doing fascinating things as well. So the book is basically, it's not sort of heavy-going history. It's a series of anecdotes, of episodes in the life of the Foreign Office during the war, both what they were doing in London and in the embassies around the world. And the embassies, the remarkable things, as the Germans rolled forward, as much of Europe became occupied, the embassies were scrambling to get the British citizens out, to get themselves out, to evacuate. In some cases, for example, our man in the Vatican, when Italy became an enemy power, the Vatican was a little neutral island in the middle, and our man, Francis Darcy Osborne, was asked to stay in the Vatican. He moved in with his butler, his dog, and his secretary, stayed there for 4 years, and in the end managed to organize an Allied prisoner of war escape line from inside the Vatican as the German armies moved towards Rome. So an extraordinary story. And there are others, like the British community interned in Tokyo for 8 months when Japan declared war on us before they could be got out. I also wanted to put the spotlight on women because, rightly, most people think that the Foreign Office at the top levels was all male, mostly Eton and Oxford. But the women were doing really interesting things right across the organization, including abroad. And I got a number of case studies of women who did remarkable, brave things in embassies around the world, usually in neutral countries like Switzerland, where a lady called Elizabeth Wiskerman was picking up political intelligence from all around occupied Europe, from businessmen, journalists, dissidents, dodgy characters in the shadows, or somebody like Freya Stark, who was an Arabist, great expert on the Arab world before the war, who was sent up to the most remote parts of the Arab world to pick up intelligence and to promote Britain. And she found she could get into the harem as a woman. So she made friends with the wives in the harem. And then when the great men came home in the evening, she was able to get at them and put across the British message. So those are the sort of people stories which I think bring it to life. And then one last theme is that in the middle of the war, the British Foreign Office started thinking about the future peace. And they began to design what became the UN, worked with the Americans on that. But while everybody else was concentrating on the war, they were concentrating on how can we make the world a better place when this cataclysm is over. And both the UN and NATO, you can find the roots of that in the planning the Foreign Office did in the war. And I think there's a message for today there. Even when the world is in disorder like now, you need your diplomats to be thinking ahead to how we can make it better when all this is over.
Oh, you definitely see it. I engage with a lot of embassies around the world when I'm traveling, and I've had a really blessed career of 25 years of bouncing from one war zone to another. And unquestionably, where we've got a great British Foreign Service and a UK State Department and an Australian Foreign Service, you feel it. You feel, and they've got the tentacles, they've got the networks, they know what's happening, they can give you great advice, and also they're always collecting information as well from travelers and business people and humanitarians and journalists. I think it really does make a big difference.
It's soft power, Dominic, isn't
Mm,
it? And military power can only be translated into political effect if the diplomats are there, to negotiate the peace settlements, to
mhm.
rebuild stability in war-torn countries, to foresee where the next crisis is coming from. And that was all true in the war as well. So, I mean, both the Australian and the British Foreign Services go back a long way. They have deep knowledge of countries, great colleagues. Anyway, if anyone's looking for a holiday read, it's not heavy going. There's some good fun in it as well, but I think it gives you a new perspective on Britain's wartime period.
Fantastic, and we'll link to it in the show notes. So if people want to know where they can pick it up, we'll link to that down below. And if we look to the future, Peter, what would success look like, or what should success look like for UK foreign policy under new leadership? And maybe also to give us a bit of background, what would be the quiet groundwork that needs to be happening today in order to achieve that success?
Okay, well, I think two levels then. I think keeping up British leadership in areas like Ukraine with the coalition of the willing, over what post-conflict Gulf Iran will look like, with a mission there to give reassurance to shipping if it's needed, a more European NATO, keeping the Americans engaged but reflecting that the more Europeans have got to do much more. I think those sort of big picture issues, Britain should continue to be influential, coming up with ideas seen by colleagues as thought leaders, and a country really pulling its weight. And then the kind of below the horizon things. I think there's a lot to be done in what I'd call the non-aligned capitals beyond our transatlantic allies and indeed our Asian allies like Australia and New Zealand. Um, Countries like Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Kenya, um, important countries, but they feel that they've been ignored by the West for a decade or more. We've been absorbed in our own issues. They're often China's largest export markets. Russia often sells them arms. And we've lost ground in many of these capitals. And I think sharing out between the kind of middling powers, we can do more quiet work to rebuild confidence that we've got the right solutions to their problems. That allying with the Chinese or the Russians isn't a good strategy in the long term. It always comes with awkward strings attached. Whereas relationships with our countries, can be beneficial, but it needs putting more effort in. How we find the time to do that, given the urgent crises in front of us, is another matter. But if the Burnham government wanted something or rather different to do, I think it would be to find that the foreign secretary was sometimes in Africa or in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific area, really doing the political diplomatic legwork to keep Britain engaged and respected in those countries.
Excellent. And Peter, one question that we ask all guests that come on the International Wiz podcast is, when you look around the world, there's so many things, from climate change, geopolitics, artificial intelligence, credit markets. There's so many places where risks can be coming from. But when you look around the world and when you're speaking with your family and speaking at conferences, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
Short term, it's the war in Europe. I mean, that is what could do devastating damage to our way of life here and across Europe. And it's not impossible to imagine that we might face some sort of conflict with the Russians. So that certainly is what I would be concentrating on in this kind of hard security world. And in the middle of a record heat-breaking summer here in the UK, I would be really putting even more effort into climate change work. I mean, I have grandchildren. Um, they may well still be alive in 2100, and I want the climate in 2100 to be livable and bearable for human beings. And given the trend we seem to be on, that has to be in doubt, I suppose. So I would urge politicians not to do the easy thing of just putting off spending on the priorities that deliver net zero, diverging from our climate change targets in in the interests of short-term support for people paying their bills this week, I would urge them to keep focusing on the longer term, recognizing that the rising generation still needs a planet that can bear human life. And there's nothing more urgent at the end of the day than that.
Well, thanks very much for explaining that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today.
It's been a pleasure, Dominic. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you for the shout out for my book.
Well, that was a great conversation with Lord Peter Ricketts. And I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on how this new leadership change in the UK is going to be interpreted internationally, what it means for continuity, credibility, geopolitics, and of course, the risks and opportunities for British foreign policy. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Andrea Crawford-Wikilund. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.